Hello, and welcome to today's open lecture. Today, we will be discussing the carbon cycle and the greenhouse effect. As you know, our climate is changing and temperatures are increasing on the planet. Not only are sea levels rising, but the ice caps are melting on the North and South Pole. One reason for this is the greenhouse effect and the carbon cycle. Today, we will be discussing the carbon cycle and how through human interference, we are witnessing the greenhouse effect on our planet. Before we begin, I would like you to take a moment and familiarize yourself with the following keywords. Let us continue. The way carbon moves around the Earth is known as the carbon cycle. It consists of sources which emit carbon into the atmosphere and sinks which take carbon out of it. The biological side of the carbon cycle has evolved throughout millions of years. It works, for example, in the following way. In this cycle, we have the respiration of animals. That is, when they breathe, they emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Then plants, bacteria, and algae take the CO2 out of the atmosphere during a process called photosynthesis, where plants generate chemical energy. When biological organisms die, some of the carbon stored inside of them gets buried and stored underground, which prevents it from being released back into the atmosphere. Oceans are also part of this cycle, and they are both sources and sinks of carbon. In fact, carbon dioxide is being absorbed and released into the oceans at approximately the same rate. The carbon cycle system naturally balances itself, and without human interference, it has arrived at what is termed as a dynamic equilibrium throughout the evolution of our planet over millions of years. A few hundreds of years ago, this dynamic equilibrium has been significantly pushed out of balance by human anthropocentric activity. Beginning from the Industrial Revolution, humans developed the need to dig fossil fuels and burn them for energy. Therefore, the fossil carbon that was left undisturbed for millions of years is now being released into the delicate carbon cycle of our planet. The way humans have changed the carbon cycle is one of the reasons some scientists say the Earth has entered the Anthropocene. That is, the geological age when human activity is the dominant influence on the planet. Today, our reliance on fossil fuels adds approximately 10 billion tons of extra carbon into the atmosphere. Think about the petroleum we use in our cars, the coal and natural gas we use for generating electricity in our power plants, or to cook our dinners. Our collective reliance on fossil fuels throughout the world is what accumulates to this 10 billion tons. Mother Nature is very forgiving, and approximately half of the extra carbon from fossil fuels is absorbed by the Earth's sinks. However, the rest of the carbon that makes it to the atmosphere traps heat, leading to a phenomenon called the greenhouse effect and warming the planet. A greenhouse is normally something very useful. It helps us grow out of season plants and foods, for example, strawberries in winter. In a greenhouse, the sunlight enters and visible light rays penetrates the glass of a greenhouse. Part of the light is absorbed by plants in the greenhouse and partly reflected on the outside as an invisible heat radiation. As a result, despite being in a cold winter environment, the temperatures within the greenhouse can rise. Our beloved planet Earth obtains warmth in a similar fashion, which allows humans and plants to survive in the vastness of the cold cosmos. Without the natural greenhouse effect, temperatures on our planet would be around minus 18 Celsius, much colder than the average 15 degrees Celsius we are accustomed to. Sunlight penetrates the gas layer of the atmosphere, and it is partly absorbed and partly reflected, just like in a greenhouse. Smart particles in the air ensure that a percentage of the reflected radiation is sent back to Earth. However, humans can cause a lot of pollution, as we discussed earlier, and produce large amounts of carbon dioxide. These small particles of carbon dioxide, or CO2, along with other human induced particles such as methane and nitrous oxide, collectively known as greenhouse gases, increase in number. And the result is like a greenhouse where the glass is too thick, so an increased amount of solar radiation is sent back to Earth, and the heat is unable to escape, and therefore causing temperatures to rise on our planet. Global warming is not a distant future event. It is happening as we speak. For example, in Japan, each spring, millions of people celebrate the blossoming of the cherry trees to mark the arrival of warm weather. These celebrations have a long history, and records of the cherry blossom festivals date back more than 1,000 years. In fact, the record of the timing of the cherry blossoms in Japan is the oldest for any flowering plant. Scientists recently analyzed this record and found that beginning in the early 1800s, the mean air temperature in March has slowly risen. During the same time period, as reflected in the figure here, we see that the flowering date has slowly arrived earlier in the season, and the trees are now flowering several days before they traditionally flowered. Global warming is blamed for the earlier flowering of the Japanese cherry blossom tree. The excessive amounts of carbon in the atmosphere has had a devastating effect on the world's climate and has changed the quality of how our planet's carbon sinks function. Specifically, we see that as the temperature of the planet increases, the dynamism of our carbon cycle also changes. For example, in the oceans, we know that cooler water can absorb more carbon dioxide. However, as our oceans become warmer, their ability to absorb and sink carbon dioxide decreases. We're also observing changes in the plant world. Specifically, we see that plants are less able to survive and die in a warming climate, which in turn limits the capacity of plant life to engage in photosynthesis and absorb carbon dioxide. Therefore, human anthropocentric activity is creating a feedback loop where our thrust for fossil fuel energy is releasing more carbon in the atmosphere, warming the planet, and decreasing nature's ability to absorb carbon dioxide. Humans have no doubt damaged the delicate balance of Earth's carbon cycle, and global warming affects all continents, and we cannot stand back and watch its devastating consequences on future generations. Global warming affects the economies and societies of all nations. Year by year, we witness how the ocean levels rise and how climate events become more extreme, and rising temperatures affect our children and the economic development of the poor and the hungry. However, the damage to carbon cycle is not irrevocable. As a first step, we need to better understand how our day-to-day economic activities influence the carbon cycle. And in this light, we have solutions and goals that are in our reach as reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals, especially SDG goal number 13, which urges us to take action to combat climate change through its targets and indicators. I hope you find these discussions interesting and pursue more studies on this topic. Please visit our campus and learn more about our programs and courses on sustainability topics.